Hi everybody, today we're going to be working on the week 10 notes on page 97 in your workbook. We're just going to continue with solving quadratic equations. So just a review of what we did last week. We started using the factoring that we learned a couple of weeks ago and applying it to solving quadratic equations, where the first thing you have to do is make sure you are equal to 0. That is still the case. You always have to be equal to 0 before you start solving a quadratic. And then we factored using one of these 5 methods right here, which we will talk about in just a second. And then we did the tee it up thing, where you set each of the factors, once you're done factoring completely, equal to 0. So for factoring completely, let's go over those methods again real quick. GCF is the first type of factoring that you check for. If it has a GCF, that's the type of factoring that you do. If it doesn't, you then count your terms. We talked about this last week. For factoring completely, if it doesn't have a GCF, you count your terms. DOPS typically goes along with 2 terms. Trinomial easy is the shortcut for the trinomial AC method, but both have 3 terms, and grouping has 4 terms. So once you count your terms, you can identify which method you would use. Remember, you can only use the shortcut if A is equal to 1. You can use AC no matter what. So if you prefer that, always do AC, but the shortcut can be used if A is 1. Now, when I say A, I'm talking about this right here. We've talked about this for a couple of weeks now. This is a standard quadratic expression. AX squared plus BX plus C. So A is just the number in front of X squared, B is the number in front of X, and C is the number on the end, typically on the end, that is by itself. You absolutely need to remember what those letters are and where they are in each quadratic equation for what we're working on today. Okay, so again, what we went over last week. You set it equal to 0, you factor it completely, which means factor it till it can't factor anymore. And then you do this last step right here, which is set your factors equal to 0, which essentially is just that tee it up that we talked about. Okay. Now here's what's new this week. Every single problem we solved last week was factorable. You're going to run into some quadratic equations that aren't factorable. If that's the case, if it's not factorable, you are going to use something called the quadratic formula. So this right here that I'm boxing in, I know it looks kind of intimidating. It's your quadratic formula. I'm going to tell you right now, you do not need to memorize this. Okay? You do not need to memorize this. I will always give it to you on a test or a quiz. You need to know when to use it and how to use it, but you don't need to memorize it. Okay? So what you're going to try and do, and this is a big review from last week, hopefully that helps, is for question 336, see first, of course, if it's equal to 0. This one is, so we are in the right setup. And now I'm going to see if it's factorable. So if a type of factoring applies, that means it's factorable. So 2x squared minus 14x plus 20 equals 0. Remember, you're only factoring this right here. So the first type of factoring you look for is GCF, and this one has one. So I'm going to start by taking out a GCF, and this one has a GCF of 2. So I start by doing my typical GCF factoring, and I divide all 3 terms by 2, and I put that 2 out in front. Okay, 2x squared divided by 2 is an x squared, or 1x squared. Negative 14x divided by 2 is going to be a negative 7, and the x comes down. And 20 divided by 2 is a plus 10. You can bring down the equal 0 at this point, but you don't have to until you're done factoring. Remember, you have to factor completely, which means I need to refer to this in the parentheses here to see if that's continually, or can continue to be factored. So I count my terms, and there are 3. There's 3 terms, and there is a 1 in front of this x squared, which means I can use trinomial easy, or the shortcut. So to start trinomial easy, I take the number by itself, which in this case is a 10, and I list its factors off to the side. So 1 times 10 and 2 times 5. From those pairs, I need to pick the pair that also adds to this middle number of negative 7. Now I also have to keep in mind I'm multiplying to that positive 10, so I can either pick a pair that's positive positive or negative negative. But since I'm adding to a negative 7, it's going to be negative negative, and hopefully you realize it's negative 2 and negative 5. Now I'm going to use the shortcut. Again, AC method will work. It's just a couple of extra steps which there's nothing wrong with if you like that method better. But using the shortcut, it's just going to be x minus 2 and x minus 5. Don't forget to bring down your GCF. And then at this point, we're done factoring, so you can bring down the equals 0. Now I want to clarify something at this point. If you're taking a test or a quiz and the directions say factor, you stop at this step. You have completely factored it and you are done. If it says to solve, that's the tee it up part. So I have 3 factors here, which means I'm going to have kind of that double T setup. You just draw a vertical line between all of your factors, and then on each underneath part of your T, you're going to set each of those factors equal to 0. So first I have 2 equals 0. In the middle, I have x minus 2 equals 0. And on the right, I have x minus 5 equals 0. And then you solve each part underneath the T for x. Now, hopefully we remember this as well. When I have this first one, 2 equals 0, there's no x to solve for there, so it's just gone. You don't worry about it at all. If your goal is to solve for x and there's no x, you can't do anything with it. Okay, next one is x minus 2 equals 0, so I'm going to get rid of that minus 2 by adding 2 to both sides, and I get x equals 2 as one of my answers. And the next one is x minus 5 equals 0, so to undo that minus 5, I'm going to add 5 to both sides, and I get that x is equal to 5. Okay, that was just a big review of what we did last week. We didn't do any of the new stuff yet. Okay, something that I'd like to bring to your attention that I skipped over before is this right here. It's starred, it's bolded, it's underlined. It's really, really, really important, especially to my students who do not like factoring, okay? The quadratic formula will work in all situations to solve. So I'm going to draw you back up here for a second. We talked about if it's factorable and if it's not factorable, okay? If it's factorable, you can factor it. If it's not factorable, you have to use the quadratic formula. If it is factorable, you can still use this quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula works all the time. So you don't know what it is yet. You don't know if you'd prefer it. So before we move on to 337, I'm going to do 336 with you again, but we're going to use the quadratic formula. Okay? So right underneath it, you have quite a bit of space underneath it in your notebook. I'm going to have you do this exact example, but using the quadratic formula method instead. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is just rewrite the problem. Normally you wouldn't have to do this, but because we have so much up there, I just want to bring down the example so I can do this. Not even worry about factoring for now, it's gone. If you don't like factoring, this would be your go-to. Yes, this one's factorable. If you liked what we just did, that's your main way to do it. Quadratic formula, I'm going to refer to this formula. I'm also going to copy that down just so it's here. So negative b plus or minus the square root of blah, blah, blah. Just copying it up there from the top. Exactly how you see it. If you see parentheses, if you see a negative sign, it all comes down. All right, here is how you do the quadratic formula. Remember this. Whoops. ax squared plus bx plus c. It's in that correct setup, and you have a's, b's, and c's within your formula. So you need to label what a, b, and c are from your original equation so that they can be plugged into this quadratic formula, which will actually just straight up give you your answer. There's a lot less thinking involved in this formula. Okay, so look, a is the number in front of x squared, so a is simply 2. It's not 2x squared, it's just the number in front of it. Okay, b is the number in front of the x, which in this case is a negative 14. And then c is the number by itself, which in this case is a 20. Okay, now that we know what a, b, and c are, what we're going to do with that is plug it into the quadratic formula where we see a, where we see b, and where we see c. So this x equals comes down. Something that I skipped over just for a little bit while we weren't working with it yet is this right here, that plus or minus. Just ignore it for now. It doesn't really come into play until your very last step, so don't stress about it. Just plug in like we originally talked about. So my x equals from the formula comes down. So does that negative sign in front of the b. Now you're going to start plugging in. You plug in b where you see b right here. Since b is a negative 14, you end up with a double negative there. From this in the formula and from this over here. You need to count both of those negatives. Ugh, I keep doing that. Ooh, let me find where we were. Sorry, guys. Found a faster way to do it. All right, I will try to not bump that again. So I have that double negative there. If you remember what a double negative becomes, that's just one big plus sign. So it's essentially positive 14. If you don't know that, it doesn't matter. You'll just hit the negative sign twice when we plug this into our calculator. Now I said don't worry about the plus or minus for now. I still mean that. Just bring it down as plus or minus and bring down that square root. Okay. Underneath the square root, you have the letter b, but it's in parentheses, so you have to bring the parentheses down, and then you're plugging in negative 14 again, because that's what b is. Close your parentheses, and then there's a squared in the formula. Okay, next in the formula after that squared is a minus 4, and then notice this part right here doesn't have any symbols between it. That means it's 4 times a times c. I'm going to use parentheses to show that. You can use the multiplication symbol, it doesn't matter. A is 2 times c, which is times 20. Okay, and then that is all over 2 times a, which is 2. So because the denominator is so simple, and it always will be, I want you guys to get in the habit of just simplifying it right away. 2 times 2 is 4, boom. You only want one number in the denominator. Only want one number in the denominator, which just means the bottom. I don't know how to spell denominator. Hope that's right. One number in the denominator. Okay, now we're going to talk about this plus or minus here. So the plus or minus, it's kind of weird, but I'm going to draw you back to the factoring. You ended up with 2 answers when we factored. 1 answer here, 2 answer here. So we have 2 answers to work with, and we only have 1 formula. The reason it's written out as plus or minus is because it's actually 2 different things you're going to simplify down. The first one is going to be x equals 14 plus the square root of that whole thing, negative 14 squared minus 4 times 2 times 20, all over 4. Then your other answer is going to be 14 minus the square root of blah, blah, blah. Same thing all over again, just copying it down exactly how I see it. So you're splitting up the plus and the minus into essentially two different formulas, but definitely 2 things you're going to plug into your calculator that are different. If you don't have your calculator yet, please find it, grab it, do whatever you got to do. I'm going to show you the 2 different ways that you can plug this into your calculator, but you only need to remember one. Okay, so again, I'm going to show you both ways to plug this into your calculator. You only need to remember one, whichever one you prefer that I show you. Okay, so the first one I'm going to show you over here with the plus, and this is actually the one I recommend you use, but some people don't prefer it, so it's the one I recommend. Just keep that in mind. So when you're plugging this into your calculator, unfortunately, you cannot type it in all at once. You can't type in 14 plus the square root of blah, blah, blah divided by 4 equals and get your answer. Your calculator doesn't understand PEMDAS. So the problem with it, and it's actually not too bad, but all you need to remember to do is plug in the top first. Again, exactly how you see it. Parentheses everywhere you see them. So you're going to type in 14 plus the square root of parentheses negative 14, close your parentheses squared, minus 4 times 2 times 20. Then you're going to press enter. And it's going to give you the top number. So take a second to practice plugging that in at this point. You should get 20 on the top. So pause if you need to, but take a second to plug that in exactly how you see it. You should get 20. If you're not getting 20, go back and look to see if maybe you missed a parentheses, you missed a negative, you missed squaring something. If you are not sure how to plug in a square root in your calculator, square root in your calculator, let me just write it right here. To get that in your calculator, you hit the second button, which is blue or green, I believe, on the top left of your calculator. And then you hit the x squared button, which is 4 buttons down. If you hit second x squared, it will give you the square root. Okay? So hopefully we all got that. If we didn't, please reach out to me, okay? Or keep practicing it with the rest of these examples for sure. I keep doodling everywhere. All right, and then my final answer, 20 divided by 4, is just 5. And notice that's one of the answers we got when we factored it. Okay, now doing that exact same thing, but with subtraction. Here's the other way that you can plug it in. Again, I recommend what we just did. Plug in the top first, press enter, then divide by the bottom. If you are one that wants to type it in all at once, you need to add all these extra parentheses that I'm putting in green. Okay. You need to tell your calculator what's on top and what's on the bottom. Otherwise, it has no idea. So if you want to plug it in that first way, again, highly recommend this way. If you want to plug it in all at once, you need to remember to put parentheses on the front and end of your top, then divide it by 4. So if you like the first way, again, highly recommend that way. Please practice doing that way again instead of this way. If you hated it and you'd rather do it with parentheses, plug it in this way instead. You should get 8 on top for this one. Let's pause it. Like I said, if you need to, absolutely pause it for a second. You should get 8 on the top, and then 8 divided by 4 on the bottom gets you 2, which was actually the other answer we got when we factored. Now that was the first quadratic formula example we did. It was very wordy and lengthy, but it won't be so lengthy when we get onto moving on, like doing one more than the first example. Those words didn't make sense. Let me try that again. Doing all those steps with the quadratic formula is because it's the first example that you did. It's actually kind of shorter than that. We don't have to split it up like this every time. That was just for me to show you what plus or minus is. It's going to be a little shorter, but you might like factoring better. You might like the quadratic formula better. What I'm going to do for the rest of the notes is show you the quadratic formula method. Okay? So if you preferred factoring, I will show you this right now real quick. For 337, it says solve x squared minus 3x equals 9. No matter what method you prefer, you're supposed to be equal to 0. This one's not equal to 0, so we have to get this 9 to the other side. It's a positive 9, so I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides. So that'll cancel that out and get me equal to 0. Now I have a little bit of a problem here because I've got 3 terms over here and I've got nothing to combine that negative 9 to. Remember the correct order. This is going to come up so many times. Ax squared plus bx plus c. So your x squared term should come down first. So I'm going to take my x squared term up here and bring it down. Next should be your x term. So minus 3x comes down next, and then the minus 9. You have to be in the right order to know that a is first, b is in the middle, and c is at the end. If you like factoring, do what I am about to do in red. If you didn't like it, just ignore me for the next minute or so. Okay, this one, when I go to try and factor it, it doesn't have a GCF, so I can't take out a GCF. I count my terms. X squared, 3x, and negative 9 have 3 terms, and it has a 1 in front. So this is going to be an easy trinomial. So off to the side, I need to list my factors of positive 9 for now. I'll deal with that negative sign in a bit. So remember, your goal is to add to the middle number here. Notice there's a problem. No matter where you put negatives, here, whatever, when you add these together, there's no way to pick a right pair that will add to negative 3. It's impossible. So this one can't factor. So again, you can check every single time to see if it factors first and use that method, or you can just jump right into the quadratic formula. It is a go-to method that works every single time. So we have to, for this one, use the quadratic formula. on x squared minus 3x minus 9 equals 0. Oh, I did it again. Sorry, guys. Just keep bumping it over here off to the side. All right, so using the quadratic formula, which I remember what it is, but I'm just going to write it again so I have it real close. You can just refer to it at the top of the screen if you'd like. I can't really see my top of the screen though, so I'd really rather show it to you like this. And I need to state what A, B, and C are from this ax squared plus bx plus c format. So remember, A is the number in front of x squared, which in this case is a 1. B is the number in front of x, which for this one is a negative 3. Make sure you don't miss those negatives. It could make or break your problem. And then C is the number that's by itself right here, which again is a negative. This one's a negative 9. Okay, so what I'm going to do is plug in A, B, and C wherever I see them in the formula. Okay, so when you start plugging this in, you bring down your x, you bring down your equals, you bring down your negative, straight from the formula. Now we have to plug in B. B is a negative 3. Because I have that double negative here again, that just means it's a positive 3. Bring down your plus or minus, and bring down your square root, and bring down your parentheses. Now I have to plug in B again. B is negative 3. Close your parentheses, squared. Minus 4 times A, which is 1, times C, which is negative 9. And that's all over 2 times A, which is 1. Now remember, try and get in the habit of simplifying that denominator ASAP. You only want one number in your denominator. Like we said right here, only one number in the denominator. That's all you got to do. At this time, when we did it the first time, I had you guys split it up. Like I said, you don't need to split it up and write it out twice. Just know what that plus or minus means. I'm going to have you guys plug it in your calculator. My preferred way, unless you like the other way, go for it, but I'm going to walk you through the way I prefer. First, plugging in with a plus. So in your calculators, you are going to type in just what's on the top. You don't even need this plus sign. Just start at 3 plus the square root of parentheses negative 3 squared, with the parentheses after the negative 3 as well, minus 4 times 1 times negative 9, and you're going to press enter. Now that's going to get you a yucky decimal. Don't worry about the yucky decimal for now. You are just going to then continue on by plugging it in, divided by 2, and pressing enter again. The first answer you should get when you plugged it in with a plus sign is 4.854102, blah, 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 blah. Your decimal will be a little bit longer than mine. My settings on my calculator just rounded a little early, but as long as you have those first few digits, you are perfect. You plugged it in correctly. Now you want to plug it in the exact same way, but with the minus. So again, plugging in just the top, 3 minus the square root of parentheses negative 3 parentheses squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 9. Press enter, then divided by 2, enter. And here's the other answer you should get. So practice plugging in your calculator until you get those numbers. Remember, your decimals will be a little bit longer than mine. Mine's just rounded a little early. That's not the whole purpose right here. I just want you to focus on these beginning first few numbers. If you have those, you're perfect. Okay, so pause it if you need more time to plug it in. I'm going to go up here and refer you back to what it told us to round to. It says round to the nearest tenth. Tenth looks like this, a decimal with one place after it. So I'm trying to round to this digit for each of these, but you have to refer to the number after it, 5 or above, give it a shove. Same thing here, 5 or above, give it a shove. So that 5 is going to bump the 8 up to a 9 for both of these. So your final answers are 4.9 and negative 1.9. Now, I told you can check every single equation that you have. If you go to check this 4.9 in your original equation by plugging it in for x, it's going to be a little off because 4.9 wasn't your actual answer. Your answer was 4.854102, blah, 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 blah. That's what you'd have to plug in to get an exact check. Actually, you don't have to check. Remember, these are all recommended checks. But a quicker check, if you are interested in that, it'll kind of give you a big idea of whether you were right or wrong, is graphing it, believe it or not. So this function that was given to us was x squared minus 3x minus 9. Remember what we talked about last week? Your solutions to a quadratic, which are these two answers that we just got, are going to be where your graph crosses the x-axis. And I'll say it again for the people in the back. Okay. Your solutions to a quadratic are where the function crosses the x-axis. So the rest of the graph doesn't even matter. If you plug this into your y equals and hit the graph button on the top right of your calculator, you'll notice that it crosses at about right here, like real close to 5. 4.9 is super close to 5 and at about negative 2, because negative 1.9, like we just said, is real close to negative 2. Your calculator. Your quadratic, your parabola might look like this. It might be upside down. Who even cares what the rest of the function looks like? All you want to check is that it crosses the x-axis at your solutions. It's a very quick check, very easy to do, not necessary, but highly recommended. So same thing over here before we flip to that next page. If you were to graph this in your calculator, boom, boom. Again, who cares what the rest looks like? You'll notice it crosses at 5 and 2. Because it crosses at 5 and 2, check. And again, you would get your graph when you plug in the original function to your calculator. So you would plug this in, whoops, with a plus there. Just taking that from up here. See where it crosses the x-axis. And if it matches up with your answers, you are correct. That works for factoring. That works for the quadratic formula anytime you're solving a quadratic. Wow, this page is a hot mess. All right, let's go to the next nice clean page. I wish it was clean anyway. Whoops, there we go. Okay. Before we move on to these examples, the first thing I want you to do at the top of the page is write the quadratic formula. You can just copy from the last page, or you can copy it from me. I'm writing it too. And I also want you to write ax squared plus bx plus c and equals 0. You have to be equal to 0 before you can start factoring or using the quadratic formula. And then one last thing I'm going to have you do before we start is write down your code word. Okay, your code word is going to be pasta. Noticing a little bit of a food pattern here. Your code word is pasta. So write that down somewhere on your notes. It will come up on a quiz question in the future. Okay, your code word for the week 10 notes for today is pasta. All right, moving right along. So going back to that big idea of being equal to 0, notice all 3 equations on this page aren't equal to 0. So we've got some setup work to do before we can continue on. So for 338, it's 4x squared plus 4x minus 8 equals 1. It's a positive 1, so to move it to the other side, I have to subtract it so that those cancel. Now, notice where I put that minus 1, right underneath this negative 8. The reason I did that is because those are like terms, and I'm going to need to combine them. It's different than the last one that we did because it had a like term to combine to. So I bring down my 4x squared, my plus 4x, and when I combine those, I get minus 9, and my equal 0 comes down. Okay, I'm going to tell you right now, this one does not factor. If you wanted to try and see if it factors first, obviously you are more than welcome to. Just trust me on this one. It does not factor. So I'm going to jump right into the quadratic formula by stating what A, B, and C are. So A is the number in front of x squared, which for this one is 4. B is the number in front of x, which is also 4. And C is the number by itself, which is -9. Here's why it's so important to get yourself equal to 0. If you didn't move that 1 over, you would have thought C was -8. Whole problem wrong. Okay? You've got to get those numbers right to make sure the quadratic formula works out. So when I go to plug it into that quadratic formula that we just so conveniently wrote at the top of the page, I bring down my x, I bring down my equals, and I bring down my negative. And then I have to plug in b. For this one, b is a positive number, so that's going to stay a negative in the long run because of the negative from the formula. And my positive b, I don't have a double negative there, so it's just going to stay -4. My plus or minus comes down, and so does my square root. Okay. Then I have my parentheses, b, which is 4, square it, minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is -9. And it's all over 2 times a, which is 2 times 4. Remember, get in the habit of just multiplying those out right away. 2 times 4 is 8. You only want one number in the denominator. Okay, and I want you guys to pause it at this point and practice plugging it in your calculator. Remember, first with a plus, then with the minus, and you always press enter after you type in the top. So again, pause it. I'm going to write down the answers for when you get back. Okay, so these are the two answers that you should have gotten when you plugged it in. This is what you get when you plug it in with a plus on top, and this is what you get when you plug it in with a minus on top. So remember, you type in the whole top, press enter, then you do divided by 8, enter, and those are the two answers you should get. Okay, if you're having a hard time plugging it in your calculator, please reach out to me through email or their office hours. I'm happy to help you guys. I just don't know what you're working on in your calculators right now because clearly I'm doing something else while you're watching this, okay? So I need to round this to the nearest tenth, which remember looks like this, one place after the decimal point. So that's this and this right here, but you have to look at the digit after it. 5 or above, give it a shove. So this is going to become 1.1, and this will be -2.1, and those are your two answers. So really the quadratic formula is not too bad, especially once you get in the habit of learning how to plug it in and rounding for sure. Okay, I'm going to do my quick check. Plug that into your calculator. So in your y equals, you're going to type in 4x squared plus 4x minus 9. And see, hit the graph button and see where it crosses the x-axis. You'll notice it crosses at about -2, just a little bit further. Boom. And at about 1, just a little bit further than 1. No matter what the rest of the parabola looks like, it doesn't matter. You just care where it crosses the x-axis. So this one works. It checks out. If you feel comfortable at this point, I want you to try question 339 entirely on your own. Okay? So pause it if you're comfortable and give it a trial on your own. I'm just going to jump right into it. So I have a problem with this one. It's not equal to 0. It's equal to 6x. So I have to move that positive 6x to the other side by subtracting 6x from both sides. So that cancels, and I'm good to go. Now it's equal to 0. But remember, you need ax squared plus bx plus c for your order of terms. So your ax squared comes down first. In this case, it's going to be 9x squared. Then your x term comes down. It's going to be the minus 6x. And then your constant, or your number that's by itself, comes down, the minus 11. So this one was first, second, then third. It's always x squared, then x, then your number. So now I state what a, b, and c are. A is the number in front of x squared, which is 9. B is the number in front of x, which is a -6. And c is the number by itself, which is a -11. So I go to plug it in, start my quadratic formula with x equals negative. Just coming straight from the formula. Then I plug in b, which is a -6. So here's another instance where I have a double negative. That just changes to a positive. After b, I have plus or minus my big square root and then parentheses. Here's where I plug in b again, so negative 6 squared, using parentheses where I need them, minus 4 from the formula, times a, so times 9, times c, so times negative 11, and that's all over 2 times a, which is 2 times 9. I'm going to simplify that right away. 2 times 9 is 18. And plug it in. So even if you were doing it with me, do pause it at this point to practice plugging it in. Plug in the top first, then enter, divided by 18, enter. I'm just going to write down the 2 answers you should get. First when you plug it in with a plus, then when you plug it in with a minus. Now remember, as you're checking these answers, mine are a little bit of shorter decimals than yours are. My calculator rounds a little bit early, but you are perfectly fine if you have those first few digits at least, because once you round it, it won't even matter. So hopefully we got those answers. Again, reach out to me if you didn't. You'll notice that your entire answer for the quadratic formula comes from making sure you're equal to 0, plugging in the correct a, b, and c, and then plugging it into your calculator correctly. So it's a lot of just plugging in and making sure you're following the formula correctly. If you can do that, you're going to get it right. If you can't do that, you're definitely going to get it wrong. So please reach out to me if you're one of those people that are struggling with this. Okay, to round to the nearest tenth, which is this digit, one place after the decimal point, I refer to the digit after it, 5 or above, give it a shove. For this first one, that 8 bumps the 4 up to a 5, so 1.5 is one of my answers. For the next one, 2 does not bump 8 up, so it's going to stay negative 0.8. And you're done. Those are your 2 answers. You can do your quick little check. You'll notice that if you do, you'll look at your graph after you plug it into your y equals, and it crosses at 1.5, so right here, halfway between 1 and 2, and at about negative 0.8, so just a little bit before negative 1. It crosses here and here. Check. And another reminder that we talked about last week, you'll see it on my answer key if you refer to that for your homework, or even if you look at the notes key. Inside of these squiggly wigglies, those curly brackets, it just is a set saying those are all of your solutions separated by commas. You don't need to know that. This is perfectly fine. All right, one more example. I would like you to practice this one on your own as well, but I'm going to get it set up for you to start. So definitely not equal to 0, but before you start doing that, hopefully you notice the distributive property. If you remember from weeks and weeks ago, I told you if you have if you have the distributive property in a problem, you have to do that first. It still applies. Anytime you see the distributive property, you do it. So x times 6x is 6x squared. X times a positive 1 is going to be plus 1x or just plus x, and then that equals 15. And you're done doing that first initial distributive property step. Now we're good to go. I've done the distributive property first. My goal is to get this equal to 0. Right now it's equal to positive 15, so I'm going to subtract 15 over. 15 minus 15 is 0, and I remember I need to be in ax squared plus bx plus c format order. So the 6x squared comes down first, then my x term comes down plus 1x or just plus x, and then your c, which is the number by itself, comes down as minus 15. We are set up now. A, b, and c should be easily findable. I want you to pause it and give it a try at this point. Once you come back, we'll be ready to go. So I'm going to go over it now. A is equal to 6 because that's the number in front of x squared. B is the number in front of x, which in this case is a 1. Whoops. And c is the number by itself, which is a negative 15. Okay, so a, b, and c, I'm good to go. I plug it into my quadratic formula, which starts with x equals negative. Now I plug in b, which is a positive 1, so that negative is going to stay. There's no double negative to cancel for this one again. So x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of parentheses. B is 1. Bring down your parentheses and square it. Next in the formula is minus 4 times a, so minus 4 times 6. And then times c, which is a negative 15. And that's all over 2 times a, so 2 times 6. Now, same method as all the other ones. You simplify that denominator first. 2 times 6 is 12. And then you plug it in. So pause it again if you decided to check it at this point, but plug in the top with a plus first, then press enter, divided by 12, enter, and then plug it again with a minus, enter on top, divided by 12, enter. Here are the two answers that you should get. So they do come out as nice fractions. You can have them as fractions, or more likely answer, you probably have them as decimals. So 3 over 2 is 1.5. Then negative 5 divided by 3 is a negative 1 point. Technically, before I round, lots of 6s and then a 7. But when you round it, that 6 bumps that 6 up to a negative 1.7. Whoops, negative 1.7. So I didn't talk about it in the first step of this one, but what you could have done, I'm just going to draw a little line here. You have 6x squared plus x minus 15 equals 0. This one's actually factorable, so I'm going to use factoring to show you the difference between your two methods, which you can decide which one you like better after. So at this point, I'm going to solve this one with factoring. You'd normally check that first to see if it's factorable, if that's your desired method. But I'm just going to tell you now it is factorable. Here's the difference between the two methods. Okay, this type of factoring is not going to be GCF because it doesn't have one. I jump right into counting my terms. It has 3, so it is a trinomial. But for this one, it has to be trinomial AC because of this 6 in front. So AC starts by taking your A and your C and multiplying them together. So for this one, it's 6 times negative 15, which is a negative 90. So I'm just going to list my factors of positive 90 for now, which is 1 times 90, 2 times 45, 3 times 30, 5 times 18, 6 times 15, and 9 times 10. Reminder, you do not need to list all of those out. If you know your ideal pair, don't list them all. Okay, remember, your goal is to add to the middle number here, so I'm trying to add to a 1. Try and take a second to figure out what your pair is going to be. Even if you prefer the quadratic formula method, guys, stick with me for this. This is a good review of factoring. Hopefully you got the pair, negative 9, positive 10. Do a quick check. Negative 9 times positive 10 is negative 90, and negative 9 plus 10 is a positive 1. But because I cannot use the shortcut for this, I need to do my AC setup, which splits this up into 4 terms. So you bring down your 6x squared. You split your plus 1x into minus 9x plus 10x, and then that number by itself just comes down, and you're going to ignore the equal 0 for now. It's not part of factoring. You're only factoring this piece. You split it up and expand this out to end up with 4 terms so that you can do grouping. So your first step in grouping is group the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms together, and then GCF each group. The GCF of your first group is going to be 3x. So you bring that 3x down and then you divide. 6x squared divided by 3x is 2x, and negative 9x divided by 3x, your x's cancel and leave you with a minus 3. Now between 10x and negative 15, your GCF is going to be a positive 5. I know it's a positive 5 because when I divide a positive 10x by a positive 5, I get the 2x that I need, and negative 15 divided by negative 5 is negative 15 divided by positive 5 is the negative 3 that I need, and these match up. You need them to match up when you're grouping. It's a huge little check waypoint that lets you know you're on the right path. So now I bring down the one they have in common, 2x minus 3. Once I do that, I don't worry about it anymore, but I put my 2 GCFs together for my next factor of 3x plus 5. You can try to factor again, but you'll notice no other factoring method applies, so the equal 0 comes down, and I'm ready to move on to my solving portion, which is t it up. So there's only 2 factors, so it's just 1t, 1 vertical line down the middle, splitting them up, and I have my t. On the left side, I have 2x minus 3 equals 0, and on the right side, 3x plus 5 equals 0. And now I have 2 solvable equations that I can get x alone with. So my first one, to get x alone, always get rid of what's being added or subtracted first. So to undo minus 3, I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So I get 2x equals 3. X is still not by itself. I have to divide by 2 on both sides, and I get x equals 3 over 2, which if I want the decimal version of, I would just do 3 divided by 2 in my calculator and get 1.5. You do that same thing with my other one. To get x alone, get rid of what's being added or subtracted first. So to get rid of plus 5, I subtract 5 from both sides. My 3x comes down, and 0 minus 5 is a negative 5. And now my last step, to get to get x by itself, since it's being multiplied to 3, I divide both sides by 3, and I get x equals negative 5 over 3, or negative 1.7. Once I divide it, I get this, and then I round to get negative 1.7. So look at the difference between the two methods. This one was definitely a tougher type of factoring because you couldn't use the shortcut, but it's really up to you which method you choose to do. If you prefer the factoring method, you still need to know quadratic formula because you need it for examples like the top two here that couldn't be factored. Quadratic formula works every single time, okay? Now you could also, real quick before we end, check this one in your calculator. Make sure it crosses the x-axis at 1.5, so right here, and at negative 1.7, so about right here. If you do plug it in your calculator, it does check out and all is good. So if you guys had any issues with this set of notes, please meet me during office hours or at least send me an email to help you guys out. I am more than happy to help, and I want you guys to get working on that homework to practice those examples. Good luck.